So without wasting any time, let's get straight into our first item then. Chancellor George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the United Kingdom, has announced the government's 4-year spending review to Parliament, revealing some of the deepest cuts in public spending in decades. Now, we're going to be speaking to well-known economist Jonathan Davis from Jonathan Davis Wealth Management in a couple of minutes. Before we listen to Jonathan, though, let's have a quick listen to the Chancellor himself.
Right on, friend, the Work and Pension Secretary is setting out proposals with my support to replace all working age benefits and tax credits with a single, simple universal credit. The guiding rule will be this: it will always pay to work. Those who get work will be better off than those who don't. It represents the greatest reform to our welfare state for a generation. It will be introduced over the next 2 parliaments at a pace that ensures we get this right. I have set aside more than £2 billion over this spending review of resources to make this happen, and it will go alongside our new work programme, which we are also funding today. Drawing on the skills of the voluntary sector and private providers, the work programme will provide intensive help for those looking for work and support for those who could look for work but currently lack the confidence or the skills to try. The Department for Work and Pensions will make savings to help deliver these schemes by increasing the use of digital applications and reducing overheads, but we will also be seeking substantial savings from the rest of the £200 billion benefit bill on top of those already identified in the budget. As I said in June, the more we could save on welfare costs, the more we could continue other more productive areas of government spending. And in the massive public consultation we conducted over the summer, the overwhelming message we received was that the British people think it's fair to reform welfare bills and reduce them in order to protect important public services. So today I announce these further welfare savings. We will time limit contributory employment and support allowance for those in the work-related activity group to 1 year. This is double the length of time for contributory job seekers allowance. We will increase the age threshold for the shared room rate in housing benefit from 25 to 35 so that housing benefit rules reflect the housing expectations of people of a similar age not on benefits. We will give local authorities greater flexibility to manage council tax together with direct control over council tax benefit, with an overall budget that will be reduced by 10% from April 2013. We will align the rules for the mobility and care elements of disability living allowance paid to people in residential care, generating savings but enabling us to continue with this important benefit. We will freeze the maximum savings credit award in pension credit for 4 years, thereby limiting the spread of means testing up the income distribution. On tax credits, we will further control the cost of tax credits by freezing the basic and 30-hour elements for 3 years. We will change the working tax credit eligibility rules so that couples with children must work 24 hours per week between them, and we will return the childcare element of the working tax credit to its previous 70% level. We will also introduce a new cap on benefits. No family that doesn't work will receive more in benefits than the average family that does go out to work. That is tough but fair. Of course, those in receipt of disability living allowance, working tax credit, or the war widow's pension will be excluded. Taken together, all these welfare measures I have outlined will save the country £7 billion a year.
Well, thanks to the BBC there for using that report. And on the line to me is Jonathan Davis from Jonathan Davis Wealth Management, no stranger to Talk Radio Europe. Good evening, Jonathan.
Good evening, Richie.
Right. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, if we carried on doing what the previous lot had us doing, we'd be spending £700 billion this year, our government would, but taking in taxes of £550 billion. We already owe, as a country, £750 billion. So we'd be adding that and taking it to £900 billion. That's getting on for about 80% of the size of the economy. How long does anyone think that you can continue borrowing more than you're earning?
That's you're earning, yeah.
Whether it's a household or a business or a government, ultimately, eventually, the piper has to be paid, and the piper is the global lenders. So what do I make of it? Actually, before I say that, if I may, what's fascinating about it all is that everyone's comparing it to the Thatcher cuts, of the 1980s, and yet, your listeners should know, Thatcher didn't cut a penny. What she did, and this was with an incredibly dry cabinet, Nigel Lawson, Keith Joseph, Geoffrey Howe, what she did was reduce the increase in spending. And what these guys are doing is actually over the next 4 years, spending pound for pound will rise. It'll rise about £40 billion over the next 4 years. However, of course, there will be inflation. So taking into account inflation, there's going to be about a 19% cut in spending, inflation-linked spending. And do they want to do this? One side says they're all millionaire toffs and this is ideology and all the rest of it. Well, no doubt part of that is true, but the large part is that if they don't do this, then I tell you, anyone who's got loans in sterling would find the interest rate rising dramatically. If they hadn't been saying these things already since the election about 6 months ago, our Bank of England rate would not be 0.5% now. It would be 2.5%. And if they didn't cut, I can tell you, within 3 months it'd be 5%. By the end of next year, it would be 10%. Look at Greece. Indeed, look at Spain where you are. You carry on borrowing like that, then the global lenders start hiking the interest rate. What would high interest rates do to the mortgage market? What would it do to businesses? The whole thing would be decimated. What do I think of it? I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's exactly what the United Kingdom requires. No doubt it's going to be incredibly painful for families, for businesses, in the relatively short term, but it's going to be a relatively short, sharp shock to the system. There's going to be an extra million unemployed. They're talking about 490,000, 500,000 public sector. Yeah, well, a lot of these people keep the private sector going as well. There's going to be 1 million extra unemployed. But it's the only thing we can do to keep our interest rates low in order to try and get the private sector to get moving again, to get investing again, to get hiring again. And that's the only way in the long term we're going to get out of the absolute mess that we're in.
Carl Emerson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, he's come out and said that the cuts are regressive, mainly because, well, he's put a preemptor on that. He said mainly because they do affect the bottom 10% of earners in society. But he did go on to say that the government could claim the review was fair if it took into consideration measures announced by the Labour government, such as an increase in the top rate of tax, which hits the richest hardest. Is there an element of unfairness in it?
The devil's in the detail. I think there's two big picture answers to that. As I say, no doubt it's going to be very hard. There's going to be a lot of pain by individual families. There's no question about that. But the two big picture answers are, as I say, referring to what I said previously, if they carried on the route that the other guys were doing or even were suggesting to do now, then I tell you the global lenders wouldn't accept it. And the interest charge that our government pays would just go up and up and up. And who would actually be benefiting from that? The bankers.
The bankers, yeah.
And the bankers would be benefiting because they'd be lending at higher and higher interest rate. And this is what the Labour crowd are wanting to do, which is truly remarkable, but true. So you tell me, therefore, what's fair. The other thing that could suggest that it's unfair in the sense that the top tier are getting away with murder again, I would suggest to you is nothing to do with this budget, because whether it's Conservative, Lib Dem or Labour, none of them are getting to the root of the matter. The nub of the issue is the bankers.
And I remember the first time we spoke, Jonathan.
The politicians the politicians are in the back pockets of the bankers throughout the world, whatever country you look at. And until we take action to sort out the banking system, no doubt also to our short-term and maybe even to our long-term detriment, in that we will lose a heck of a chunk of our financial services, we're not going to sort out the problem. But I'll tell you what, if it were me, I would sort out the system. I would reduce financial services in the UK, and you know what? I'd give an opportunity for the real economy to get moving. Look at Germany. Look at how successful that is by exporting real things that people want to buy. And that is the country we should be looking at. They don't have a particularly big financial services industry. If only we had half of their economy.
Let me read you a little bit from, again, from the BBC today, from their correspondent online. He says, George Osborne says, rather, he would introduce legislation tomorrow in order to extract the maximum sustainable tax revenues from financial services. He said he wanted to make he wanted banks to make a fair contribution. He said, in fact, the banking industry said the move would have an impact, particularly on overseas banks operating within the UK. The government expects the levy to generate about £2.5 billion a year, this levy they're talking about. What do you think of that?
I think it's a joke. $2.5 billion levy, big deal.
It sounds like nothing, isn't it?
Just in their bonuses, they're going to get, £7-8 billion? Never mind the bank profits themselves. No, it's an absolute joke. And they're pretending that by doing so, they're doing something against the bankers. The bankers are laughing their heads off. I assure you, that's what they're doing. I'll tell you what they have to do. It'll never happen, but this is what they have to do. 3 things. 1, they have to separate the casino banks in the city from the high street lending and deposit takers.
The responsible banks.
Excuse me?
Yeah, you're right, the responsible banks. Those that behave responsibly.
Well, no, I mean, I can't talk about Spanish banks, but in the UK, Barclays, for example, I mean, nothing particularly against Barclays, but just for example, they're on the high street, and they're also in the city. They've also got a casino. It's called Barclays Capital. HSBC's got HSBC Markets, and so on and so on. Royal Bank of Scotland has the Halifax, which of course used to be Building Society. It's got Bank of Scotland. And also, of course, it's got a massive city operation. No. Separate the banks who own high street banks, the city banks that own high street banks. They've got to get rid of them, because you know it's an amazing thing. You one of your listeners puts €1,000 into the local caja. That then immediately goes to Madrid, and the Madrid centre can then lend that to lend €950 for simplicity to someone else, and eventually that €950 gets back into a bank. That bank can then lend €900 on strength.
I remember us discussing this a couple of weeks back when I started on the programme. Yeah, it's amazing.
Exactly, and
it's amazing.
Money is swirling around the system based on tiny amounts.
But Jonathan, a listener, sorry to interrupt you, but a listener listening to this, and you're quite right in what you're saying, would be tearing their hair out, asking, why has nobody legislated against this sort of practice? Because I know you're going to give me the answer, and we know the answer, but you have to tell me anyway.
Politicians are in the back pockets of the bankers. Now, I don't say that in an exaggerated fashion, but you know, ultimately, if the banks, when the banks are making a lot of money, they're paying a lot of taxes to the governments, so the governments love them. But that's all fine and well. So why don't the banks take the losses as well?
Absolutely. That's a very good question, isn't it?
Anyone at all who knows anything at all about banking knows that bankers in the long run never make money. In the long run, they always take too many risks. Thus, the taxpayer always bails out the bankers. So going back to what they need to do, 1, they need to separate the casino from the high street banks. 2, the government should say tomorrow, not that they will do, but they should say, look, bankers, if you lose money again, if you lose hundreds of billions of pounds again, we're not going to bail you out. And thirdly, they should require the banks to hold much larger reserves based upon what they're lending. So they've got €1,000, they can lend 10 times that, whereas they have been lending 40 times that. So the risk is magnified. Do you know, if any government ever said to bankers, we will not bail you out, and there it is in writing, I tell you categorically, the risks the bankers would take would dramatically reduce in 24 hours, and that forever would sort out boom and bust. But unfortunately, that is the root of the problem, and the politicians are just not doing anything about it. Instead, they're taking money from you and me, and they're giving it to the bankers. And I know I sound like a communist. Believe me, I'm not. I'm a fervent capitalist. But banking as we know it is not capitalism. If it were, then the bankers who lost money would go out of business.
That's right, they'd be gone. They'd be gone, absolutely. Like any other company that gets into difficulties.
Exactly.
You would be gone. The Shadow Chancellor, Alan Johnson, he's basically saying they would have done this in half the time. Basically, isn't that what he's saying? They wouldn't have reduced spending as quickly as the Conservatives. But that doesn't sound very sensible to me, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, first of all,
and the Lib Dems, by the way.
I just simply don't believe it. Anyone who knows anything at all about recent UK politics, can they seriously say that if Gordon Brown had won the election and he put his best mate Ed Balls in as Chancellor, are they seriously saying that Gordon Brown and Ed Balls would have cut spending? Come on. There's no way they'd have been continuing to spend ad infinitum, just like Spain, Greece, Latvia, Iceland, Portugal, Italy, you name it, as well as round the world, Japan and the US.
Yeah.
Absolute arrant nonsense. And Osborne said something very, very interesting, that in fact Labour had sought for a 20% real cut in spending. In fact, Osborne's come up with a 19% fall, so it's broadly there or thereabouts.
Before I know you're very busy. Before I let you go, you must have a quick comment on the Irish situation, because again today, the IMF has been talking about Ireland today, and the Irish economic situation is absolutely dreadful, isn't it?
Just as bad, in fact, as many other countries. We are in. And this is going to sound crazy, but I totally believe it. We are in a global depression. The last depression of the 1930s resulted from the fallout of the biggest debt bubble in history at that time. And here we are. We are in the fallout of the biggest debt bubble in history ever. We are in depression. If we weren't in depression, how come central bank interest rates are below 1% and have been there for a couple of years? The very definition of depression. Excuse me? You're right, the very definition of depression. Well, for example, and the simple fact that, some people say depression only happens when your economy goes down 10%. Well, the economies would have gone down 10, 15% had the governments around the world not bailed out the banks, had not borrowed on the strength of future taxpayers' money to give to the bankers. The economy would have gone through the floor, and you know what would have happened? We would have had cheaper fuel, cheaper houses, cheaper properties, cheaper salaries, cheaper everything. And although it's counterintuitive, I think your smart listeners, if they just think through that, if things are cheaper, then people will buy. People will buy more. And the economy will get going. But instead, we have this ridiculous collusion between politicians and banks and central banks that we have to keep inflation up. They talk about we don't want high inflation. Well, we're going to have high inflation, not necessarily the next year or two, but we're going to have massive inflation because they're printing money and putting it into the banks' pockets. The UK has got a reprieve because of what happened today and what's going to happen in implementation over the next few years. Having said that, though, we will print money again just before the next election, because that's what governments do.
Jonathan, it's been fascinating listening to you again. This will run and run, of course, and I'll be in touch with you again in the not too distant future. Thanks again for your opinion. It's Jonathan Davis Wealth Management, and that's the website address as well, isn't it?
JonathanDavisWM.com.
WM.com.
All the very best.
Lovely to talk to you. Thanks again, Jonathan. You too. I'll be in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.